100 facts about James Monroe. This video's probably not going to get any views, but here's a particular fact. Okay, when James Monroe died in 1831, he was the third president in a row that died on July 4th, American Independence Day. James Monroe also was the fifth president of the United States, and he died on the 50th anniversary of the American independence. Uh, Jefferson and Adams also died um, on the same day, 5 years before James Monroe died. They died in 1826. He died in 1831. James Monroe is the only president besides Washington to have a capital named after him, Monrovia. James Monroe is officially considered the last, like, founding father president. James Monroe Doctrine inspired TR, Teddy Roosevelt. At the time, James Monroe was sent by President Thomas Jefferson to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. James Monroe originally negotiated for New Orleans and Florida, but got a whole bunch of states like Louisiana to Montana. This was a huge purchase. It was around 15 states for 15 million. That was around 530 million acres, or about 4 cents per acre. So it was a pretty good deal. James Monroe was the first of 9 presidents to die in New York. And why till you die? James Monroe, only like 4 presidents died in NYC, which he was one of them. James Monroe was basically born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He had 500 acres. James Monroe is the only president to date to have a daughter named Maria. Very lovely Spanish name, I should say. James Monroe was the first sitting president to cross like the Canadian border. James Monroe was the first sitting president to see Niagara Falls. Up to this point, there was no president that took a formal trip outside of the country. James Monroe was the first. That was pretty cool. He was the first to cross the border. He crossed the border within like the first 3 months of his presidency. Teddy Roosevelt, hey, you remember that guy? He was the first president since James Monroe to travel outside of the United States. Isn't that a fun little tie-in with each other? James Monroe had a record until Teddy Roosevelt beat it, almost like 89 years after James Monroe. James Monroe at first did not visit like New Orleans as a civilian, but he did it as a president. That's pretty cool. James Monroe was definitely like wounded. He was like a 18-year-old lieutenant that was pretty young. James Monroe studied under his buddy Thomas Jefferson. James Monroe was a senator of Virginia, making him the first future president to serve in the U.S. Senate. James Monroe ratified the U.S. Constitution. James Monroe was was uh, was like the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War at the same time. That was pretty cool. James Monroe was the last president to be elected like unanimously. Like only one person like did not vote for James Monroe. They voted for future president John Quincy Adams. This is not the first time that John Quincy Adams would be a spoiler for, a president. It was like this guy named William from New Hampshire who voted for John Quincy Adams. James Monroe, even though he didn't get that vote, he still got 98.3% of the vote. Washington got 100. William supposedly voted against Monroe to make sure Washington was the only president to have like a perfect record. James Monroe required 5 states when he was president. It was Mississippi all the way to Missouri. James Monroe ties with George Washington as the president with the most states entering the Union during his tenure. Benjamin Harris was the guy who needed to be beat. James Monroe was the only president besides George Washington to be ambassador to France beforehand. James Monroe was close presidents with this French guy who described him as the last hero. James Monroe studied under the tutelage of Thomas Jefferson for 3 years. So this is giving you the time. James Monroe was the third president in the row to be U.S. Secretary of State. James Monroe was the third out of four continuous presidents to be Secretary of State. Secretary of State back then was like the vice president. Like if you got in, then you were the man. Okay, he was the third ambassador, second ambassador to France to become president. James Monroe was the only one out of the five presidents not to attend this little college. James Monroe had a tutor. James Monroe's wife was known as a great beauty, the great lady of the White House. James Monroe had the shortest gap between leaving office and dying. His daughter was like married a lawyer at the White House. James Monroe was the last president born in the colonialist era. He was born before the Declaration of Independence. Big whoop. James Monroe saw like three gains when it came to being president. Really defined what the sea and shining sea is. James Monroe started the spoil system. James Monroe was the only president to be impeached and replaced of a major office before becoming president. George Washington removed him from being like the governor of Virginia and then put him as the minister of France. So that's some context. James Monroe delivered like the first State of the Union, which this habit of delivering it wouldn't be fortified until Wilson. James Monroe was the last president to be a Democratic Republican. James Monroe was the guy who officially like started the first military college. James Monroe was the guy who was the first president to really have a panic or like a recession happen under him. James Monroe was the primary drafter of the Monroe Doctrine was John Quincy Adams. No, I guess he earned that vote. The Monroe Doctrine said that Europe shouldn't be in the business of the New World. Basically, James Monroe originally wrote this, or at least Adams originally wrote this about Latin America. Monroe, of course, had Adams do this whole signing of the Spanish territories. James Monroe was seriously injured during the Revolution. James Monroe was a friend of like Ash, who was like related to Thomas Jefferson. James Monroe had 3 children. James Monroe was in a lots of debt, about $30,000 worth. James Monroe, of course, was buried in New York City. James Monroe was the only president to have two Congress positions, Secretary of State and Secretary of War. James Monroe created the first Navy base in the Pacific. James Monroe had one of the most best like pre-presidential like politician like positions. He was like a senator, a governor like 3 times. He was like a minister of France and other countries, and of course he had those 2 positions in the cabinet. James Monroe daughter brought up some controversy with her closings, despite the term of the era of good feel. The era of good feelings was created by this newspaper. The era of good feelings saw like 4 candidates at the same time. One of them were like John Quincy Adams and Andrew Johnson, both connected to James Monroe. He was not a wealthy man towards the end of his life, yada, yada, yada. Um, James Monroe instrumented like Thomas Paine being freed from a French prison. James Monroe cousin JJ took him under his wings. James Monroe had a multi-month like tour that was very successful in 1817. James Monroe adopted like a 13 stripe 20-star flag called the Flag Act of 1818. James Monroe was the only president to have his daughter like married in the East Room. James Monroe delivered like his inauguration address on like the 4th because of a weekend dispute. James Monroe played a big role when it came to Gabriel's rebellion, which there was this supposed slave that wanted to like do a uprising, and he played a big role in getting them captured. Following his death, he was moved from New York to Richmond, Virginia, 27 years later, to correspond with his anniversary, like he would have turned 100 years old. James Monroe dispatched Andrew Jackson to kill Indians. James Monroe originally like 39 people was supposed to die in Gabriel's rebellion, but Monroe pardoned 13 of them for some reason. Should have pardoned all. James Monroe even wrote to Thomas Jefferson about this issue. James Monroe only emancipated like 1 slave throughout his life, Peter Marks. This slave, ironically enough, married like Sally Hemings, like family member. So that was pretty cool. James Monroe was the only president to like be ambassador of France like twice. Once under Washington, again under a Louisiana Purchase with Thomas Jefferson. Again, he was the de facto like biggest man, and also acted as the vice president at one point. He was the one who created the pocket veto. Well, the one that first used the pocket veto. The era of good feelings is kind of misleading, since Democratic Republicans fought over the slavery issue during this time, really was split. He lived with his daughter Maria in New York. That's why he died in New York. Um, of course, he had countries like Colombia created during his administration. He had a famous cook for his daughter. He was the first governor to largely during his tenure. As governor, he had like a big issue with the XYZ affair. He, of course, had a famous death in which it was signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but it kind of died in a fire. Um, um, James Monroe was the first president to face like the whole panic of 1819. It goes more in depth about that. He was the first president to have like federal highway. He was the during his administration, like there was a break off between the 2 factions of the Democratic Republicans that split into like the Democrats and the Republicans we know today. he made a formal issue. He made a formal announcement that was popular, that was known as the State of the Union. He was the last president to be a revolutionary war combat veteran. And yeah, that's all his facts. Please like and enjoy this series.